Sorry for the late change of rooms, because the beamer didn't work in the other room, so we had to change rooms in the last moment. So it might very well be that there are still some guests on their way from the former lecture hall to this lecture hall. They will probably drop in, but at least you are there and you found a seat. The others still have to find a seat. Okay, welcome to the third Alexander von Humboldt lecture already in this year's series on making European spaces. Welcome also to our special guest for today, Professor Simin Davoudi of Newcastle University in England. Professor Simin Davoudi is one of the directors of the Institute for Research on Environment and Sustainability. She held and holds a great number of important other positions in the field of spatial planning. A list too long to mention here. What for this Alexander von Humboldt lecture series is especially relevant is of course her long-standing interest in European territorial development and governance. In this framework also her recent book on conceptions of space and place in strategic planning, published by Routledge of last year I think, needs to be mentioned. And this also brings us to the special topicality of her lecture of today on spatial planning and European identity building in this year's series of the Alexander von Humboldt lectures. We started off this series with a lecture by Stuart Eldon on the genealogy of territoriality, where he underscored the high political, strategic and political economic dimensions of the conceptualization of territory, next to the more calculative aspects of space. This implies that we cannot think of an ordering of space or of spatial planning only taking space into account. We always need to look what space and spatial orderings mean for relations between people and for spatial identity. Space and place thus have to be thought together. In the last week's Alexander von Humboldt lecture by Louisa Bielashevitz, we focused mainly on the relations between the European Union and its neighbors, in which it also became clear that the management of border relations, or to put it differently, the ordering of human space in relation to non-European space, is again closely related to what the identity of Europe or of the European project is. Again, identity and spatial orderings are closely related. And today, Professor Simin Davoudi can directly link to this debate and show how also the conceptualization of spatial ordering within Europe is directly linked to the issue of identity building. And in this way, and this is also an essential element of our Alexander von Humboldt lectures, she also integrated more human geographical perspectives on spatial identity building with the spatial planning and ordering perspective. And of course, this relationship between these subdisciplines is valid on all spatial scale levels, but is especially relevant for the European level, where mostly an established institutionalization of European spatial planning is still lacking. But let us not wait any longer and listen to what Professor Simin Davoudi has to tell us. Professor Davoudi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to contribute to your highly regarded Alexander von Humboldt lecture series. Let me get the PowerPoint sorted first, and if I can. So, how do I escape? Escape, yes, where is escape? Well, we can, yeah, I just couldn't read that. Yeah, there we are. Be there. Never mind. I think we should just say, okay, yes. I think we should click this. Yeah, that's it. Yes. Yes, I was just going to say that I'd like to start the lecture with the great man himself, whose public lecture in the early 19th century in Berlin apparently was so popular that they had to find new assembly hall to fit the people in. I hope one day these lecture series be as big as that. Apart from making a tribute to one of the founders of modern geography, the reason for mentioning him at the beginning is the relevance of some of his ideas to what I'm going to say. Humboldt rejected the mechanistic view of the world as gigantic clockwork. This view was a view which was dominant in the Enlightenment era and underpinned positivist science. He urged researchers to seek knowledge about the chain of connections by which all natural forces are linked together and made mutually dependent upon one another. And he emphasized that it is the perception of these relations that exalt our views. It is this emphasis on understanding interconnections which links some of his ideas to what I'm going to talk in relation to spatial planning. But before that, let me sketch a pen portrait of the evolution of European spatial planning. The emergence of the European spatial planning agenda has a long history, which goes back to the creation of the Council of Europe, in fact, not the European Commission, in 1949, which until the 1980s provided a key arena for discussion about spatial development. In the EU, the emerging regional policy in the 1970s provided an important milestone for such debates. But the real upsurge in what we now call European spatial planning happened in the 1990s, the decade which marked both the widening and the deepening of the European integration. The impetus included the 1986 Single European Act, the prospect of a single European market, and also an accelerating level of EU legislation and policy development, which was mobilized to a large extent by Jacques Delors, who was at the time the president of the European Commission. Rooted in the French planning culture of aménagement du territoire, he saw territorial management as a necessary extension to other EU policies. By and large, the key promoters of the spatial planning agenda were French and Dutch. In 1988, the Dutch government advocated the idea of European spatial policy in its fourth spatial planning report. 1 year later, Datar, which is the French statistical agency, produced its famous blue banana map, which portrayed a polarized image of Europe, where a highly developed core stood against an underdeveloped periphery. In Latourian terms, this map served as an immutable mobile, an inscription that translated the European space into diagrammatic form, reducing the complex spatial relations to a single sheet of paper and exerting significant agency and influence. So it was not a coincidence that in the same year in Nantes, informal council of ministers, planning ministers in Europe, decided to embark on a long 10-year process of formulating European Spatial Development Perspective, or the ESDP. Parallel to this, the DG Regional Policy set up a committee for spatial development and began to publish Europe-wide spatial analysis in documents such as Europe 2000 and its follow-up Europe 2000 Plus. These carved out multiple spaces of cooperation by transcending the rigidity of the national boundaries. However, they themselves led to a new set of rigid boundaries as they became institutionalized under the Interreg program. So the 1990s marked the height of the enthusiasm for European spatial planning, which in turn was a belated response to the wider recognition that place mattered in the social and economic fortunes of localities and in the coordination strategies of governance. As Neil Brenner suggests, space is becoming a central object of political struggle in contemporary world. It's no longer merely the medium or theater of sociopolitical conflicts, but one of their constitutive dimensions. In the 2000s, attempts to keep spatial planning on the EU agenda was given a further boost by the ESPON research program. This began to produce pan-European spatial analysis and created an epistemic community around notions of spatial planning, spatial development, and later on territorial cohesion. Whether any of these, ESDP or ESPON or Interreg cooperations, could be considered as European spatial planning as such is a question in itself. But I'm not going to dwell on that, because what happens under the banners of these activities share a concern for spatiality and is widely known as representing the European spatial planning. Instead, what I'm going to focus on is what kind of spatiality is conveyed by European spatial planning. What type of European space is constructed by it? And what is the alternative conceptualization of European space? I will draw on the conceptual framework which I've developed in this book that was mentioned earlier. And the framework is based on two distinct traditions of intellectual inquiry in the social sciences: the positivist and the interpretive traditions. Positivism refers to an empiricist approach to scientific knowledge. It considers nature as independent, reason as unprejudiced, and the unitary scientific method as the appropriate way of explaining causal relations in both nature and society. Positivists consider a sharp distinction between matters of fact and and relations of ideas, as David Hume famously put it. The interpretive tradition, on the other hand, considers knowledge as a matter of understanding rather than explanation. It suggests that unlike the natural world, the social world can only be understood from within, rather than being explained in terms of cause and effect. Social phenomena are seen as distinguishable from natural ones because they depend on the meaningful actions of individuals. They are intentional. This means that in the social domain, instead of seeking to explain the causes of behavior, one is to seek the meaning of action. The interpretive tradition has been very much associated with postmodernism and its objection to the grand narratives that are offered by positivism and indeed structuralism. My main proposition is that although there are signs of an emerging interpretive understanding of a space in European spatial planning, the positivist construction of a spatiality still dominates the making of European space. I'll start with discussing some of the key features of the positivist approach and its influence on European spatial planning. I will focus particularly on how the European space is conceptualized, organized, and represented, and also on the role of evidence in this process. I will then outline the contours, what the contours of an interpretive conceptualization of a space and place would look like. Positivism portrays an absolute view of a space, which is rooted in Euclidean three-dimensional geometry, and it's been reinforced by Newtonian physics. A space is seen as a neutral container, an entity in itself, independent of objects and events. For positivism, place is objective, bounded, self-contained, and measurable. Unlike the interpretive tradition, positivism has a long history in spatial planning, with its heydays in the 1960s, 70s systems theory. An early example was the highly influential Charter of Athens. Published in 1933, its portrayal of the city as the embodiment of four functions became a modernist manifesto for planning practices in post-war Europe. It's left its mark on numerous cities around the world. The Charter was the brainchild of a group of avant-garde architects who founded SIAM, the Congress, the International Congress. The SIAM city was to be built from scratch on a blank canvas and then filled in with human activities. Le Corbusier, the renowned exponent of SIAM principle, was of the view that we must build on a clear site. He usually used capital letters. He advocated that the city of today is dying because it is not constructed geometrically. The solution was to be found in physical design. Although the European spatial planning doesn't explicitly use such a physically deterministic language and doesn't concern itself with the city scale, the spatiality that it conveys bears some of the hallmarks of positivism. Firstly, European space is often presented as a self-contained entity, which is bounded by real or imaginary borders. So, physical features are considered as natural boundaries of the European continent, where spatial relations come to a halt, and flows of people, goods, and cultures are overlooked. The administrative boundaries are the most prominent ones in European spatial planning. While efforts are made to transcend national boundaries, the perimeter of the European Union is always clearly delineated to show who is in and who is out and at any particular time. The ESDP's notion of gateway cities, for example, reinforces this view of the EU as a fortress to which gateways at seaports provide access. And now we have a new boundary created by and for the European spatial planning itself. This delineates the S1 space and demarcates what Lefebvre calls conceived spaces of planners and analysts. These bounded spaces are, of course, contested. Their making is a highly political process, not just in the obvious case of the European Union, but also in the case of the S1 space, which is widely seen as a technical process. In fact, the boundaries of S1 space are as heavily guarded as those of the EU. Not through passport control, of course, but through the imposition of a rigid and fixed template for mapping. The blue line around the template, which doesn't quite show on this slide, but you will see in the other maps, is a representation of a boxed-in view of European space, a self-contained entity detached from the rest of the world. Occasionally, analyses are allowed to look beyond the boxed-in Europe in projects within ESPON, like a project called Europe in the World. But even then, globalization is often seen as benign, as a one-way force of change which localities passively receive rather than actively shape. This delineation of the external boundaries performs an important role in the European integration project and European identity building by separating us from them and portraying a unified image of European space. However, this projected unity remains in tension with the real and imaginary internal boundaries of Europe and its diversities and conflicts. Another sign of positivism in European spatial planning is the view of space and place as objective and measurable, constructed through quantification and factualization. The most striking example of this is seeing the European space as a collection of statistical units called knots, and focusing only on those spatial relations that can be measured with comparable indicators and data at the knots level. Quantitative indicators and physical attributes have become the dominant narratives in European spatial planning. They're the ones that are often drawn upon to build a distinct place identity for Europe. For example, the ESDP presents Europe as a distinct place because it is a peninsula and has a much longer coastline than the USA or Japan. It then uses quantitative macro trends in GDP, employment, population, and density to distinguish Europe from elsewhere or to differentiate between different parts in Europe. For example, a frequently used simplistic indicator for highlighting diversity in Europe is the eligibility for a structural fund. What is less common is a social and cultural construction of European spatiality around values, norms, beliefs, aspirations, and memories. Following Latour, such an overemphasis on quantification reflects and constitutes the understanding of spatiality as matters of facts rather than matters of concern. By the latter, he implies paying attention not just to the objective and physical matters of space and place, but also the subjective and social concerns about space and place. Another key feature of positivist approach to spatial planning is the aspiration to tame space and create order, which was mentioned in the introduction to this lecture. This will to order has its origin in modernity. It is based on the 18th century Enlightenment project which Humboldt was challenging. He was questioning the dominant intellectual view of the world as mechanically ordered, its part susceptible to scientific discovery and its problems amenable to scientific solutions. This desire to tame space has been inseparable from the search for generating truth about the city, constructing spatial laws, and applying them to spatial organizing principles. Michel Foucault calls these principles planning technologies, by which particular rationalities can be implemented in practice. Two such organizing principles have been particularly persistent in European spatial planning. One is creating a spatial equilibrium, and the other is ordering space into nested hierarchies. Again, an early example of the will to order a space is the Charter of Athens. It considered cities as being in a state of chaos because of the uncontrolled and disorderly development of the machine age, suggesting that the development of cities suffers from the absence of control. Ordered, neatly classified, and separated functions underpinned its urban solution. Siam's utopian vision of a good city was one in which there was a state of equilibrium among all its respective functions. And this was to be achieved by the power of plan as epitomized in Le Corbusier's dictum, "The plan must rule." This quest for a spatial equilibrium was later given an egalitarian dimension by the redistributive regional policies of the 1960s and 70s, which aimed to create balanced regional development. Although the redistributive dimension of the balanced development policy has been increasingly undermined, its use as a spatial ordering principle has become the cornerstone of the European spatial planning. Indeed, a key principle of the ESDP, which has had major leverage in national planning policies, is the development of a polycentric and balanced urban system. The polycentricity term in the European spatial planning is embedded in the hegemonic narrative which defines the EU as a single economic space. that is in competition with other economic blocs across the world. Within this limited view, spatial relations are defined by their inclusion in or proximity to what is called the global economic integration zones, which apparently, and according to the ESDP, is concentrated in the core of Europe, and therefore has created a persistent view of European space as a polarized core periphery. The core periphery conception has been represented by various metaphors and fixated in diagrams such as blue banana that I mentioned earlier, European megalopolis, golden triangle, and pentagon. This last one, the pentagon, was coined by the ESDP, and you can see the diagram on a slide. This conceptualization of European space has had a remarkable framing power in the way spatial relations are articulated. For example, the space-time distance from the core often determines what constitutes peripherality. Places are seen as remote or ultra-peripheral if they are far from the core, irrespective of being close to other parts of the world. From this economically driven and physically deterministic perspective, European space is considered as being imbalanced and disorderly. So the ESDP's prescription, which resembles the modernist will to order, is that a polycentric settlement structure across the whole territory of the EU with a graduated city ranking must be the goal. That this is an essential and prerequisite for the balanced and sustainable development of local entities, and providing for developing the real locational advantage of the EU vis-à-vis other large economic regions in the world. Of course, in addition to this, a strong competitiveness agenda, the idea of balanced development also carries an egalitarian intention, which is a publicly justified collective goal. No question about that. However, the means by which this goal is to be achieved has remained limited to stylized spatial structure, which often are along a continuum of concentration and dispersal. The underlying assumption is that morphologically balanced territories are socially equitable. Therefore, emphasis is put on improving physical accessibility or developing complementary functions between geographically proximate places and privileging nearby relations to distant networks. Another planning technology for ordering a space is the use of a scalar hierarchy, which has its origin in Christaller central place theory of the 1930s. This was a highly influential spatial organizing principle, which assumed that the complex dynamic relations could be ordered in a nested hierarchy of settlements based on the uniform distribution of service centers in hexagonal arrangements. Although Christaller himself is rarely mentioned in European spatial planning, his idea of nested spatial hierarchy is used to order spatial relations. These hierarchies are constructed through a statistical analysis of functional interactions. It's true that such analysis can potentially articulate dynamic spatial relations, but such a potential is hardly materialized because only one function, i.e. economic, and one indicator, i.e. travel to work journey, is usually used. In the European spatial planning, the potential is even more limited because the analyses are based on the reductionist measure of a fixed time distance for identifying what ESPON calls functional urban areas. But despite the limitations, these FUAs are used instrumentally to subdivide European space into smaller units and then classify them according to a handful of functions. So some places become megas, which you can see what it means on the slide. Others become local FUAs, and so on. The problem with classifications like these is that firstly, their static nature doesn't match the dynamic reality of sociospatial interdependencies. Secondly, these allocations inevitably lead to some places gaining priority over others for future development and future investments, and only on the basis of a few reductionist measures. So, for those of you who may be familiar with the ESPON program, it wasn't surprising to see that the ESPON policy stakeholders were insisting on checking the list of FUAs before its publications. And they were trying to influence the classification itself to see if they can upscale their own places to a mega status. Despite this highly political process and the social implications of such classifications, the process is always misconceived as a technical and scientific exercise. A point which leads me to the role of evidence in the making of European space. Positivism considers spatial planning and policymaking in general as a rational process in which value-free experts rely on evidence to solve well-defined and neatly structured problems. It rests on the assumption that a clear dividing line exists between knowledge and power, experts and policymakers, technical and social dimensions, and objective and subjective knowledge. For positivism, evidence has an instrumental place in policymaking. The interface between evidence and policy is seen as a linear process where the data collection and analysis lead unproblematically to formulation of planning solutions. It disregards the disjointed and incremental nature of the real world of spatial planning. It underestimates the mismatch between how the policy process should work and its actual messy, uncertain, and essentially political realities. The instrumental view, which was typical of the comprehensive rational planning of the 60s, 1960s, and 70s, has recently enjoyed an upsurge under the banner of evidence-based policy in the European spatial planning. The creation of ESPON program was certainly based on this instrumental view of evidence-based planning. However, Despite its rhetoric of assuming a sharp line between the world of policy and the world of science, ESPON researchers, myself included, have been repeatedly pressed to come up with what is often called in that circle, punchy policy messages, even before the research was completed. Despite its extensive criticism, the positivist view of evidence policy interface has been very resilient and indeed very popular amongst both policymakers and researchers, because both of them implicitly cherish the concept of objective and value-free knowledge. For the policymakers, its emphasis on scientific, technical, and objectivity provides a kind of policy rationality and legitimation. It's seen as a pragmatic resolution of the controversies in which policymakers are embroiled. For the researchers, it gives the impression of being sheltered from the intrusion of the messy ambiguities of political debate. However, despite the rhetoric and the desire for this technical objectivity, the way evidence is used in the European spatial planning is inseparable from the social and political processes in which actors are engaged. Because spatial planners in particular do not uncover facts like geologists do, but rather like lawyers, they organize facts as evidence within different arguments. All engage in persuasive, rational arguments focused and attached to value objectives. In the European spatial planning, such value objectives are persistently squeezed out or masked by a positivist misconception which equates evidence with facts, credible evidence with quantitative methods, and good results with measurable and mappable indicators. As you see here, the first draft of the ESDP, official draft of the ESDP, both confirmed the role of ESPON as the evidence base for the ESDP and stressed that it should concentrate on the technical and the scientific aspects in the drawing up and periodic updating of the ESDP. Of course, there is nothing wrong with grounding of policy in evidence, but the overemphasis on quantification and the use of two-dimensional maps as the only representation creates a dominant spatial imaginary which is far from the complex reality of spatial relations. These technically conceived spaces may serve a useful analytical and administrative purpose, but they achieve little in creating a sense of place with which people can identify. To use Lefebvre's trialectic of spatiality, as he calls it, too much emphasis on conceived spaces of planners and analysts would undermine the attempts to incorporate lived spaces of imagination and perceived spaces of daily routines, i.e., the complex ways in which societies experience and engage in and with space. I'd now like to briefly outline how the interpretive tradition would approach spatiality in spatial planning. The interpretive tradition considers space as relational and dependent on the social and cultural processes and substances that make it up. This relational view of space is often attributed to Einstein's theory of relativity and his time-space concept. But the idea that space is relative and not absolute is much older than that. It goes back to Leibniz's philosophy. In his view, space is relational in the sense that it doesn't exist independent of objects and events. It's constructed from the relations between them. In the words of David Harvey, processes do not operate in, but actively construct space and time, and in so doing, define distinctive scales for their development. Place here is defined subjectively, with people living not in a framework of geometric relationship, but in a world of meanings. Space and place are seen as socially and culturally produced. The interpretive tradition, as manifested particularly in postmodern geography, attempts to expose the contingent nature of space and puts the emphasis on fluidity, reflexivity, contingency, and connectivity. An interpretive approach to European spatial planning would complement the physical readings of the European space with its social and cultural meanings. It would combine matters of fact with matters of concern and considers spatiality as emerging and continuing to evolve from the interrelationship between natural and physical characteristics, social expectations, cultural norms, power dynamics, and political bargaining. For the interpretive approach, technical rationality of quantitative indicators is just one amongst multiple and often competing rationalities which together shape a continuous making of European space. Interpretive spatial planners value the encounters between these rather than shying away from the complexities that arise from them. Again, mirroring Lefebvre, interpretive planning considers space as not just analytically conceived, but also physically lived and culturally perceived. For interpretive planning, the normative dimension lies in shifting the balance away from the abstract conceived space to embrace the imaginative lived space as a way of enhancing its potential to reorient the perceived spaces of everyday life. This means drawing not just on the technical, but also on the social and cultural spatial imagination for understanding spatiality. If we dig really deep into the ESDP, we will of course find glimpses of such social and cultural understanding of European space. And by that, I don't mean the repeated references to cultural heritage, which often means physical monuments and natural assets. I mean the ESDP's attempt to describe European identity through non-economic, non-physical attributes, such as referring to Europe's diversity in terms of culture, languages, histories, and traditions. Another interesting example of not seeing Europe as a space bounded by physical objects, with a seaport acting as its gateway, is when the ESDP refers to the cultural centers as European gateway cities. Whether these are intentional or not, they indicate an awareness that the making of European space is a process shaped not just by economic forces, physical boundaries, statistical analysis, and administrative organizations, but also crucially by social encounters, cultural exchanges, historical memories, and everyday life experiences. In summing up, it is important to mention that unlike the planning practices of the mid-20th century, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, contemporary European spatial planning emerged from concerns about lack of connectivity between different policy sectors. It emerged as a desire to coordinate these policy sectors. Such concerns can be clearly traced in the documents that I mentioned earlier on. They can be traced in some of the spatial visioning activities under the Interreg program, and they can certainly be traced in the ESDP. A good example of the ESDP's attempt to promote interrelationship is its influential idea of urban-rural partnership. Another example, which you can see on the slide, is some of the interesting cartographical experimentations which have tried to represent complex interrelationships. But these remain as islands of innovation in a sea of established Euclidean tradition that continues to privilege physical geographies of proximity over relational geographies of connectivity. The kind of connectivities that Humboldt would have liked us to seek, and which lie at the heart of an interpretive approach to European spatial planning. This requires acknowledging the complexities, uncertainties, and contingencies of spatial connections, and putting the emphasis not on eliminating these, but on seeking opportunities from them, and expanding the space of novelty and adventure. What drives interpretive planners, in the world of somebody in the audience, is a desire to connect rather than to control space and time. Having said that, to translate a new relational understanding of space and place into the realm of spatial planning practice requires a paradigm shift. There are encouraging practices if you look very closely at what's happening at the moment. But if these are to be developed, further debates are needed amongst a fully engaged planning community. My hope for this lecture was that I hope that I have actually managed to make a modest contribution to that bigger debate. Thank you very much.